all for being here today. As Tara mentioned, my name is Julia Kam, and I directed the Internal Attention Lab at the University of Calgary in Canada. And today, in this talk, I'll be going over some research on the electrophysiological markers of mind wandering, and specifically how it contrasts with task-focused attention. And in doing so, I'll be highlighting how EEG can be a useful tool for addressing these kinds of questions and beyond. Okay. So, similar to this person here, I'm sure we've all had this experience of our minds wandering away from these online meetings. You may be coming up with a to-do list for the evening or thinking about plans for the weekend. And now that I've primed you, your mind may likely shift away from this talk to another time and place at some point. Now, this exemplifies the phenomenon of mind wandering, which refers to thoughts that are unrelated to the task or the external environment. It typically involves attending internally to cognitive processes such as autobiographical memory recall and decision-making and so on. Focusing your attention on the internal world is a fundamental human experience, and research in the lab and in real life has shown that it can take up to 50% of our awake time. And so we know that mind wandering has been linked to positive outcomes. A very common example is that during mind wandering, we're more likely to come up with creative solutions to unresolved problems. And more pragmatically speaking, we tend to spend a lot of our time mind wandering to the future. So making very concrete plans about what we want to do today or in the next weeks to come. However, more often than not, it's associated with negative outcomes. And the more common one that we often hear about or can relate to is impaired task performance. So imagine you're reading a book and your eyes are going down the page, but your mind wandered away. You're likely to show impaired reading comprehension. Or let's say you were driving, you're more likely to miss a turn if your mind wasn't fully attending to the road. And on a more sort of severe end of the spectrum, it's also been associated with clinical symptoms, specifically those that are associated with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or major depressive disorder. So despite the prevalence and impact of mind wandering, we've really only begun to gain a better understanding of mind wandering in the last couple of decades or so. And so you might ask at this point, well, how do we study mind wandering, a phenomenological experience that only exists within our minds? So for that, we turn to thought sampling. This is a commonly used and a very well-validated measure of mind wandering, in which subjects directly report their attentional state as on task or mind wandering in the moment when they're performing a task. So let's say they were doing some variation of a go-no-go task where they have to press a button whenever they see a number and withhold their response whenever they see a letter X. And then occasionally they get asked, well, where was your attention at? And they might say on task for a few times and then end up mind wandering. So these blocks vary in length so that the participants can't predict when they're being asked. And what typically happens is then we take a preceding window, so a behavioral neural response, whatever it is that we're recording, within this window between 10 to 15 seconds that's normally used in the literature. And then we average all of those responses as a function of whether the report was on task or mind wandering. And that's how we compare what's going on in the brain or behaviorally when people report being on task versus mind wandering. Now, earlier studies have primarily focused on behavioral measures, which has been shown to typically worsen during demanding tasks. And then we use these behavioral fluctuations to find out when people are mind wandering to corroborate these subjective reports. However, behavioral performance can be explained by many factors other than attention. And, by definition, we are not engaging with the environment or the task at hand. So there's really no direct behavioral index of mind wandering per se. So for this, we turn to EEG to uncover, this covert attentional state. We'll first talk about ERP components, which are useful biomarkers of cognitive operations, and they're also really useful for revealing conditional differences. And not only do they reveal these correlates of mind wandering, but given their temporal position, they also reveal which stage of information processing is impacted by mind wandering. And this is something that behavioral measures cannot provide. So now we're going to go over a series of studies that looked at how mind wandering impacts information processing and what these ERP correlates are. In this first study, we're first going to talk about sensory level processing. So what we see here is time on the x-axis, amplitude on the y-axis, and this is the ERP waveforms that are time-locked to a visual stimulus presented in the periphery, measured on over the occipital midline sites. The gray line here indicates the ERP waveforms during on-task reports, and the green line indicates mind-wandering reports. And we looked at this P1 ERP component, which indexes sensory processing of visual stimulus. And what we see here is that the P1 ERP component is significantly reduced during mind wandering compared to periods of on task, as indicated by the gray line. And there's also this shift in latency. At the same time, we see a very similar pattern in the auditory domain, in which we looked at the N1 ERP component here now, indexing sensory level processing of auditory stimulus measured over frontal central midline sites. And again, we see this reduction in the N1 ERP amplitude during mind wandering relative to on task. So along with many other studies, we found that mind wandering is linked to this reduction in ERP components indexing sensory level processing during mind wandering. And this suggests that when our attention drifts off task, this can lead to a reduction in the intensity of sensory evoked cortical activity across multiple sensory domains. And one thing to mention here is that in a review that we're currently working on, that approximately 60 to 70% of studies have found similar patterns in which the ERP component during mind wandering, the amplitude of which is reduced compared to on task. And there are no studies that have found the opposite results. So later on in the information processing stream, we found, again, very similar patterns. Now, this time it's time locked to a target in that variation of the go-no-go task that I just talked about a few slides ago. And what we're measuring here is the P3 ERP component measured over parietal midline sites. The green lines again indicate two different types of mind wandering that I won't be differentiating today, but what we see here is that this P3 ERP component is significantly reduced during mind wandering relative to periods of on task. Other studies have found this as well, and regardless of whether this task stimuli is relevant to the task or not. So far we've talked about studies using fairly simple lab-based stimuli, such as numbers and squares and so on. And what we wanted to do next was to see whether these effects apply to more ecologically valid stimuli, and especially those with higher affective saliency. And so what we did was we presented participants with images of hands in painful and non-painful situations, which tends to elicit this response that reflects individual sensitivity to perceived pain. And again, it's indexed by this P3 ERP component measured over similar sites. And again, we see a very similar pattern in which mind wandering is significantly reduced in reducing the P3 ERP component compared to periods of on task. So taken together, this shows that mind wandering is associated with the attenuation of cognitive level ERP response. And what we show here also is that it's not specific to the kinds of stimuli we use, rather it seems to occur across different contextual representations. And it also supports the idea, this theoretical framework, that when we're mind wandering, it seems to be the case that it draws these resources that we normally dedicate to external stimuli away and redirecting it to our internal attention in order to facilitate and maintain our trains of thoughts. And again, in this review that we are currently working on, we show we found that about 60 to 70% of studies have found a similar result. And the P3 ERP component is by far the most commonly studied ERP component in the field of mind wandering. All right, so far, not only have we identified some ERP correlates of mind wandering, but using ERPs, we've also addressed questions of how mind wandering impacts external processing. However, we know that EEG also contains very rich information in the frequency domain as well. So now we'll go over a series of studies that looked at spectral correlates of mind wandering. Here, we're first going to talk about the posterior alpha. This is the most common EEG measures across both ERPs and spectral correlates of mind wandering. And the most robust finding here is that there is an increase in posterior alpha activity during mind wandering relative to periods of on task, typically measured over occipital midline sites. What I do find important about this is that this difference is occurring in a window that is way past stimulus-evoked response, which is marked by 0 here. It's a visual simple attention target detection test. And so what this tells us is that this increased alpha activity is indexing some sort of more of a background activity that's occurring during these periods of mind wandering, and something that is not related specifically to the stimulus at hand. So here we show, along with many other studies, that mind wandering is associated with greater occipital alpha power compared to periods of on task. Another frequency band that is commonly looked at is the theta band. And this is a little bit more variable compared to the alpha activity. So in this particular example here, we're showing, they're showing increased theta activity during mind wandering relative to on task. And while a handful of studies show this, there are also other studies that have found null results or reduced theta as well. So occasionally mind wandering is linked to lower theta activity, typically measured over frontal central sites, but also over the occipital sites, as in the case here as well. An emerging measure of mind wandering involving theta is the frontal theta beta ratio. So it's the ratio of this theta activity here, which is typically measured across 4 to 7 or 8 hertz, to the beta activity in the beta frequency band, which is approximately between 15 hertz to about 25 to 30 hertz. And what we see here is this frontal theta beta ratio is maximal here across frontal somewhat central sites, and it's greater during mind wandering relative to periods of off task. Now, there are only a handful of studies that have looked into this measure, but they have all found increased frontal theta beta ratio during mind wandering, which reflects some level of cognitive or attentional control. So, a summary, so far what we've shown is that mind wandering disrupts early and late stages of processing of external stimulus in the immediate environment. These are just a handful of studies that have reported these findings. And once again, the majority of studies have found that, have found these patterns. Some studies have found no results, but there are no studies that have found the opposite. In terms of spectral correlates, mind wandering is most strongly associated with increased posterior alpha activity. This is a marker that we also see during periods of rest when participants are typically sitting and relaxing and not attending to any external task or activity in particular. And finally, mind wandering is at times linked to increased theta and as well as frontal theta beta ratio as an index of either attentional control or involving some aspects of memory and intentional processing. So these are a summary of the EEG markers of mind wandering that have been found in the field, and similar to what was discussed in the last talk, this is a very, very young field, and a lot of these studies have emerged in the last 10, 15 years or so. So there's several future directions that I think will help move the field forward that I'll highlight a little bit now. So first here, we know that so far we've talked about mind wandering being attention that's directed away from the external environment or a task. But what we don't know is what's actually going on in our minds when we're mind wandering. And so to sort of delve deeper into the types of thoughts or the nature of these types of thoughts that we have during mind wandering, one future direction concerns clarifying these spatial temporal characteristics of these types of thoughts. And to that end, we've recently found that there's a marker for the kinds of thoughts that we have that wander from topic to topic without any sort of goal-directed constraints. And what we see here is, again, an alpha power, but this time measured over frontal sites, in which when we are engaging in thoughts that wander from topic to topic, we see this increased frontal alpha power, again, in a time window that is far away from the stimulus-evoked response window. And this marker has also been linked to creative processes. And so we are slowly, gradually trying to understand the kinds of thoughts that we have when we're mind wandering, and also the electrophysiological correlates of these thoughts. Another future direction concerns trying to predict mind wandering in naturalistic environments in real time. And to that end, we are trying to use machine learning models to predict mind wandering currently offline using EEG features. So these are ERP markers that we've already talked about. And then auditory tasks, we've looked at the N1 ERP component and the P3. And here we found that machine learning models using EEG features can accurately predict mind wandering states within and across subjects. Performance generally is not incredibly high compared to other cognitive functions, but it's above chance. And finally, we'd like to look at also how different clinical populations differ in their patterns of mind wandering. So now that we've established these normative patterns in the general population, we like to look at, for example, individuals with ADHD, and we've been looking at how they differ in terms of their frequency of mind wandering and the electrophysiological correlates as well. Other populations in which mind wandering is relevant to concerns involves major depressive disorder as well as different anxiety disorders. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.